Christy Nome said, this is a quote, direct quote, "What happened was our ICE officers were out in an enforcement action. They got stuck in the snow because of the adverse weather that is in Minneapolis. They were attempting to push out their vehicle, and a woman attacked them and those surrounding them and attempted to run them over and rammed them with her vehicle." End quote. And then she said that the officer who shot Good acted, quote, quickly and defensively to protect himself and others. And you guys, that's not even close to the truth. It's literally a completely made up story, and there's not even a shred of it that matches what actually happened. But this is not an isolated incident of a politician getting it wrong, right? This is in continuity with the history of the US lies, which is a country based on stolen land and lives dispossessed and borders enforced through violence and deception. From the treaties that promised Mexicans that they could keep their land, but then no, they were swindled, to the false justifications for war abroad, to the construction of illegal as a category to criminalize entire populations, the U.S. has long used lies to normalize and enforce power. Nome's statements are part of this lineage. Hello and welcome. I am Professor Peyton, and today I'm excited to talk to you about a work/author that just means like so much to me. And she's been on my mind a lot with everything that is happening in the US right now. I'm recording this in January of 2026, and my heart is really heavy. So I'm going to get into it, but yeah. Let's process some shit together. So Borderlands, La Frontera, The New Mestiza by Gloria Anzaldúa is a blend of history and poetry and storytelling and theoretical writing that explores the hybridity of the Chicano culture and people, with a special focus in the U.S.-Mexico borderlands. Anzaldúa defines a term, mestiza consciousness, which is a sort of mixed consciousness that is born from cultural intersection and historical trauma, and a fluid identity that rejects the psychological, sexual, and spiritual borders of race and gender and sexuality. Okay, so this book is written in Spanglish. Anzaldúa writes in Spanglish, which is a natural blending of Spanish and English, and she makes the political decision to not translate either language. So what this choice does is make clear who she is writing for, right? Typically, writers are forced to publish in standard English to make their writing more accessible to the general population. But linguistically, the book embodies Anzaldúa's argument, and that's what makes her writing, I think, very powerful and deeply resonant for Chicanas and Latinas. But the framework that Anzaldúa offers has been used like far outside of the Chicano and Latino community. But I want to start with the history component to get us situated, because I think that Chicano history is not a history of people crossing borders the way that most people wrongfully assume, but it is a story of borders crossing people. So before the Spaniards came to colonize and start this whole project, what is now the U.S. Southwest was indigenous land, and that was home to many distinct indigenous nations, each of which had their own systems of governance, of trade, kinship, and spirituality. And so Spanish colonization, beginning in the 16th century, we know that it brought sickness, conquest, forced labor, land theft, religious conversion, and the imposition of a racial caste system that was designed to manage bodies and relationships while justifying extraction and exploitation. So fast forward, like by a lot, in 1821, Mexico gained independence from Spain, and the northern territories, what we now call California, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and parts of Colorado and Nevada and Utah, this was Mexican land, right? The people living there were Mexican citizens. Many of them were indigenous or mestizo and mixed race, with deep generational ties to the land that long predated the United States, like as a whole. So during this period, the U.S. actively encouraged Anglo settlement in places like Texas, positioning white settlers as pioneers rather than as immigrants, even though they were entering sovereign Mexican territory. And that framing mattered because it laid the groundwork for manifest destiny, the belief that the United States was divinely destined to expand westward, and for the racial logic that cast Mexico as uncivilized and unfit to govern land that really just the US wanted to control, right? So to be clear, this was propaganda. It goes that far back, truly. So the US-Mexico War, which took place from 1846 to 1848, that was not an inevitable clash. It was a deliberate act of expansion driven by US imperialism and the ideology of manifest destiny. After the United States annexed Texas in 1845, which was a move that Mexico never recognized as actually legitimate. Both nations were disputing where the southern border of Texas actually was. So Mexico said that the border was the Nueces River, while the U.S. insisted that it was way farther south to the Rio Grande, which would obviously dramatically expand U.S. territory. So President James K. Polk, who was a huge advocate for westward expansion, sent the U.S. troops into this region, fully aware that Mexico would view the presence of American soldiers there as a provocation, right? So when fighting broke out in 1846, even though obviously Polk was the one that sent his troops there first, Polk used that to declare that Mexico had shed American blood on American soil, even though that soil was land that was Mexican. Right? So Congress quickly declared war, framing the conflict as defensive, while the U.S. military launched coordinated invasions deep into Mexican territory, occupying California and New Mexico, and eventually Mexico City itself. And that war was absolutely devastating for Mexico because obviously the U.S. forces were better funded, they were better armed, they were driven by a racialized belief in white supremacy, while Mexico was newly independent and politically unstable. So they struggled to have a sort of unified defense, and civilians ended up bearing like enormous costs. Towns were occupied, land was illegally taken, and violence against Mexican indigenous people was just like widespread. It was seen as necessary. So by 1848, with its capital under U.S. occupation, Mexico was forced to sign the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo under conditions of extreme coercion. The treaty required Mexico to cede nearly half of its national territory to the U.S., including what would become California and Nevada and Utah and Arizona and New Mexico and parts of Colorado and Wyoming. And this transfer of land radically reshaped the map of North America. And this was not consensual. This was not a mutual agreement. This was through military force and legal pressure and the assertion of U.S. dominance and white supremacy. So the war didn't just redraw borders. It transformed hundreds of thousands of Mexican residents into Americans, into American racialized subjects overnight. So now they were declared citizens of a nation that had just conquered them, which then laid the groundwork for the dispossession and the surveillance and the criminalization that would follow. And that's kind of what we're seeing still today. So it's important to know that the treaty also promised that the Mexicans who were living in these newly annexed lands, the Mexican people who were living in all of those areas that became the U.S. overnight, the treaty said that they would be allowed to remain on their property and retain their land grants and receive U.S. citizenship with full legal rights. So on paper, the treaty recognized their ownership and their residency, but in practice, these promises were systematically undermined, right? Land grants were challenged in English-only courts, intentionally fucking over Spanish speakers, right? Legal documents that they had from Mexico were declared invalid or insufficient, and legal fees were bankrupting families, and settlers were occupying land while those cases were dragging on for years. So violence and intimidation and fraud were extremely common and supported, and many Mexican and indigenous landholders were effectively swindled out of their land through a legal system that was designed to favor Anglo settlers. So the treaty did not fail accidentally. This was designed to fail Mexican Americans or Chicanos through law and bureaucracy and racialized power, transforming land-owning Mexican citizens into dispossessed subjects within a nation that fucking hated them. So the border moved, and with it came a new legal regime that classified all of these long-standing residents as suspect and inferior and foreign. So for decades, movement across the border was common and necessary, especially for labor. But then over time, the U.S. began to criminalize that movement through border patrols and mass deportations, including people that were now U.S. citizens were getting deported. And they had all these programs that were exploiting Mexican labor while then also denying their permanence or their belonging. So the category of the illegal immigrant was not, it's never been a natural like truth. It was always produced by law to manage labor and race and national identity. And ironically, despite the fact that Mexicans were there first, the U.S. produced the category of the illegal immigrant specifically to target those exact Mexicans whose land they just stole, right? So while the word migrant alludes to migration, which is inextricably intertwined with movement, U.S. white settlers continue to ignore their migration from Europe, which would make them like the true immigrants that they're speaking of, and instead they call these people who have been there illegal immigrants, right? And I think understanding this history complicates contemporary conversations about immigration and enforcement, especially in a moment when ICE is operating far from any geographic border, right? ICE is relying on the fiction that the border is fixed and natural and eternal, when in reality it's new-ish and violent and very much historically contingent. So what we are witnessing today is not a new crisis, but the continuation of a colonial logic that treats certain bodies as permanently removable and perpetually out of place, and others through manifest destiny have their like right to be here and their right to ignore their own migrant history. And so this is why Gloria Anzaldúa insists that the border is not just a line on a map, but a wound that lives in the body. So the ICE raids that are happening in Chicago and Minneapolis and all across the country are not, they're very clearly not about protecting the US-Mexico border, right? They are reenacting the original violence of conquest in present-day bureaucratic form, demanding proof of belonging from people, while most of these white ICE agents themselves disavow and remain willfully ignorant of their own migrant histories. So that is not border enforcement. That is just, this is historical repetition, right? And so I think that talking about this history, we have to, like, before we decide who belongs here, we have to reckon with how here was made. So in the preface to Borderlands, Anzaldúa says, and this is a quote, "The borderlands are physically present wherever two or more cultures edge each other, where people of different races occupy the same territory, where under, lower, middle, and upper classes touch, and where the space between two individuals shrinks with intimacy." Okay, to be in the borderlands, that's the end of the quote, by the way. To be in the borderlands is to be in a constant state of reiteration of non-belonging and of difference and of alienation. Anzaldúa talks about how experiencing life on the borders, again, not just physical borders, but racial and gendered borders as well, like in the body. Anzaldúa talks about how these kinds of borders force women of color to acquire a mestiza consciousness, or an awareness with the capacity to view two or more perspectives simultaneously. So she's naming a form of consciousness that is produced through survival mechanisms living inside contradiction. Mestiza consciousness emerges when a person is forced to inhabit multiple systems of meaning at once, often violently, without being allowed to fully belong to any of them. So when she says to view from two or more perspectives simultaneously, she's talking about being able to recognize how different worldviews, indigenous, colonial, Mexican, Anglo, Catholic, queer, patriarchal, feminist, all of these operate at the same time, even when they contradict each other. So rather than collapsing those tensions into an either-or framework, Mestiza consciousness holds them together, refusing purity and coherence or any sort of like easy resolution. So Anzaldúa argues that Western thought relies very heavily on binaries, right? Think of like the civilized versus the savage, legal versus illegal, masculine versus feminine, black and white, straight and queer. All of these binaries are tools of domination. But mestiza consciousness disrupts that logic by seeing how each category is produced and enforced and then made to appear natural. So people with mestiza consciousness are often hyper aware of how they are being read in different contexts, how power shifts depending on language or space or audience, and then how the same action can be interpreted radically differently depending on who is watching. And Anzaldúa is reframing this sort of double consciousness as a form of epistemic insight. So mestiza consciousness carries an ethical demand because it sees from multiple angles at once, and it resists that urge to resolve conflict through exclusion. It's basically rejecting binary logic. Like you can't fight binary logic with binary logic. So instead of asking which side is right, mestiza consciousness asks how the conflict itself was produced and then who benefits from maintaining it. And that's why Anzaldúa positions mestiza consciousness as a tool, like a potential tool for transformation, rather than like any sort of identity marker, because she's saying that it offers a way of thinking and being that can imagine new forms of relation beyond borders and binaries and purity politics, even if it remains, and it does, grounded in the pain that made such a vision necessary. Anzaldúa brings up also Nepantla, that's another concept in Borderlands, as a concept that emerges from her own lived experience of being in between multiple worlds at once, culturally and linguistically, racially, sexually, and spiritually. So Nepantla means being forced to live in between. To live in Nepantla means you are not allowed to fully belong to any single world, but you are required to move between several of them at all times in order to survive. So that word, Nepantla, comes from Nautl and literally means the space in the middle. And while it does maybe feel a bit abstract at times, she doesn't only define it abstractly. I think she actually illustrates it through her writing and her, like the structure of the book itself, right? She's blending English and Spanish and poetry and prose and theory, right? Typically, poetry and theory are held at opposite ends, and she's saying they articulate different things together, and when we put them together, we get more than if we look at either one in isolation, right? So Nepantla appears when she's talking about living as a Chicana, living as a queer woman, a bilingual person, and as a person of indigenous descent with also colonial lineages, which are all identities that society likes to position as contradictory or incompatible and are obviously also villainized by the nation state. She introduces Nepantla as the psychological and social space of tension created by borders, both literal and metaphorical. For example, she writes about feeling pulled between the US and Mexico, and between English and Spanish, and between traditional gender expectations, especially in like Catholic Chicana culture, and her queer identity as a woman of color. So this in-betweenness produces disorientation, discomfort, and hyper-awareness, but it also produces insight and vision and the ability to see multiple perspectives at once. So it's a little bit intersectional in how she's talking about it, but she doesn't stop at the intersectional oppression. She's talking about what is gained from that, how the ability to see all of those multiple perspectives at once, right? Nepantla is the experience of translating yourself constantly and anticipating how you will be read before you even speak, knowing the rules of multiple worlds, even when those worlds like contradict each other, and then never being able to fully rest because belonging is always conditional. And this is not a concept that is just cognitive. I would argue that it is nervous system level. It is in the body. So what I find most horrifying about ICE right now is that they claim to be an apparatus that enforces belonging, right? But we see Renee Good was a white U.S. citizen, a mother, an artist, and part of a queer family. And she was a neighbor. She was a neighbor looking out for her neighbors. And yet she was killed in the context of federal immigration enforcement. I think Anzaldúa might say that Renee's murder highlights the arbitrary and constructed nature of borders and belonging. So, in other words, Renee Good's whiteness changes the social perception of her killing, but it does not make state sanctioned violence any less part of the same structural logic of the border, and not the physical border, the psychological border. So in Borderlands, Anzaldúa repeatedly shows that borders, literal, political, and psychic borders, all produce hierarchies of belonging and threat. So historically, whiteness in the US has been coded as proximity to full belonging or safety, while Black and Indigenous and brown bodies are automatically assumed suspect, illegitimate, right? Illegal. So in this sense, Renee being white does expose I think a big contradiction, right? She occupied a racial identity that was socially coded as safe or protected, and yet she was still erased through state violence. She lost her proximity to white safety by offering protection to her Black and brown neighbors, and I would say as well as her queerness, right? We know that patriarchy and heteronormativity are crucial pillars of white supremacy. And personally, the moment that I saw more of Becca Good, Renee's wife, on the murderer's cell phone recording, it became a lot more obvious to me that personally, I think that this agent of the state was looking to punish not just Renee, but obviously Becca too. And I see that whiteness has very much shaped the social narrative around Renee's death, right? It's drawn more media attention and legal outrage and public empathy than very similar violence against brown or Black people that they have been facing for decades at the hand of ICE, if not centuries, at the hands of state-sanctioned white supremacy. And I think Anzaldúa might notice this tragedy as evidence of how society hierarchizes grief and legitimacy, while the underlying violence, the state claiming authority to remove and surveil and take life, that remains constant across racial lines. And I think Anzaldúa would also be deeply critical of the way that Kristi Noem and J.D. Vance and other government officials labeled Renee Good as a domestic terrorist within hours of her killing, despite the fact that no actual investigation had taken place. And their words didn't even line up with the video evidence about what actually happened, right? I mean, Noem specifically painted a very different picture of what actually happened. And I'm going to quote this here. Kristi Noem said, this is a quote, direct quote. What happened was our ICE officers were out in an enforcement action. They got stuck in the snow because of the adverse weather that is in Minneapolis. They were attempting to push out their vehicle, and a woman attacked them and those surrounding them and attempted to run them over and rammed them with her vehicle. End quote. And then she said that the officer who shot Good acted, quote, quickly and defensively to protect himself and others. And you guys, that's not even close to the truth. It's literally a completely made up story, and there's not even a shred of it that matches what actually happened. But this is not an isolated incident of a politician getting it wrong, right? This is in continuity with the history of the U.S. lies, which is a country based on stolen land and lives dispossessed and borders enforced through violence and deception. From the treaties that promised Mexicans that they could keep their land, but then no, they were swindled, to the false justifications for war abroad, to the construction of illegal as a category to criminalize entire populations, the U.S. has long used lies to normalize and enforce power. Noem's statements are part of this lineage. She fabricated danger to justify state violence, painted the victim as a threat, and then positioned the agent of the state as righteous. And this kind of logic, I believe, we can better understand through Anzaldúa's work, the way that the border and the way that those who enforce it demand proof of belonging from innocent people, while the actual murderers are granted immunity, and all the while, we're making up stories that serve U.S. power rather than any sort of factual truth. And their base eats it up, right? People believe Noem's story and similar narratives because the U.S. has been training its population to accept certain lies about borders and identity and belonging and threat for centuries. From the very beginning, the U.S. has constructed categories of who counts as human, who counts as legal and deserving of protection, and then who doesn't. And these categories are enforced by stories of power. When someone like Renee Good is labeled a threat, that lie fits an existing mental template that they've already set up. The dangerous outsider, the rule breaker, the person who threatens safety and order, right? And that template is embedded into education, media, political rhetoric, and even like cultural mythologies. It's so familiar that they prime you to make the lie feel believable, even when literal video evidence contradicts exactly what they're saying. And beyond that, the lie is emotionally effective, right? Fear and outrage on a physiological level bypass any sort of careful scrutiny, right? So they activate this loyalty to in-group narratives and then amplify polarization. And so these people don't just believe Noam's and Vance's stories, they want to believe it because then it reassures them that the system is protecting them and punishing threats. But the truth is obviously way more messier and destabilizing because it challenges those neat binaries of safe versus dangerous, legal versus illegal, us versus them. And quite literally, these people are not smart enough to begin to deconstruct their own binary logic at any level. So I find it ironic that 1984 by George Orwell is a required reading in most high schools, but because we force kids to read only for a grade or to pass a test, there's actually no encouragement of critical thinking, and people miss the point. So I've seen that quote going around. The party told you to reject the evidence of your eyes and ears. It was their final, most essential command. And I think it's scary how much it fits, right? There's so many videos from so many angles that shows very clearly what was said and what was done. And yet the MAGA fan base has convinced themselves to not trust their own eyes and ears, but to constantly outsource all thought to agents of the state. So video footage literally shows one thing, and officials tell the public another, and then believing that lie is part of the social and psychic infrastructure of the border itself. So Gloria Anzaldúa did live to see the very beginnings of ICE, but she did not live to witness how, like, immigration enforcement would later expand into all of these U.S. cities and become a tool for everyday policing. ICE was formally created in 2003, and she passed in 2004. So she saw the birth of the agency, but not the full bloom of the logic that now drives all of these raids in places like Minneapolis and Chicago. And so I'm kind of just hoping that this short little podcast and this history and Ansaldúa's work makes it clear that borders, literal, legal, psychological, and social, are not neutral lines. To understand the world that we live in today, where ICE raids are way far from the US-Mexico border and where lies are repeated and believed as truth and where belonging is conditional and weaponized, we need tools like Mestiza consciousness and concepts like Nepantla. These frameworks help us see multiple perspectives at once and understand the systems that produce harm. And then we can imagine ways of living that don't rely on oppression and exclusion. I'll likely do another video on Anzaldúa specifically because I cannot not situate it within recent events. Anzaldúa's work obviously predates these events and I think expands like beyond what I just gave you. But I do think that we are in a situation in the United States where I think a lot more people, a lot of us knew, but a lot more people are starting to recognize that the illusion of Democrat versus Republican and that binary logic has locked us into what Gloria Anzaldúa calls a duel of oppressor and oppressed. So Anzaldúa talks about how when we lock ourselves into these counter stances and we as the opposing group are always just reacting against what it is that the dominant group is doing, we're limited by whatever it is that we're reacting against. And I think right now it is a time to get proactive. It is a time to really deconstruct your binary logic and the ways that the US education system and media and politics have psychologically created these different borders for you, keeping us isolated not even just from each other, but from different parts of ourselves. And for all of the people who identify as liberal or are even just advocating for reform of ICE, if you are not supporting the complete abolition of this agency, I think you have some more work to do. Specifically, I've heard a lot of the defense be that there are ways to legally come to this country. And a lot of the people that are saying that are people who are European, are of European descent. And while a lot of Europeans believe that their ancestors came here legally, there was no legal system. That's all of this has been constructed to fit white supremacy. And so if you are not looking at the root of the problem, again, I think you have some more work to do. Maybe read some more Anzaldúa. Or at the Delvian Institute, we offer small discussion-based seminars where you can dig deep into history and literature and theory in a more intimate group setting. And we also do one-on-one guided learning that is like fully tailored to your interests and your questions and your goals. So whether you want to keep studying Anzaldúa in depth with me, or you want to read other feminist works, or just explore how power and belonging operate today, we at the Delvian Institute can create a space to guide that learning with you. But thanks for listening so much. I'll see you next week.